Chapter 19. The crisis over, Roland felt suddenly exhausted from his experiences. He slowed his walk up the street. So far, no one had stopped him. No one seemed to have noticed his exit. Just ahead, Roland could see the end of Grimmauld Place. He knew he would be fairly safe once he rounded the corner and turned into a new street. In his mind, Roland started framing his report to Wizard Pilkington. The dog, the cloud, Bellatrix, his breach of the rules, the loss of his wand. It wasn't a report he was looking forward to make. He was in a lot of trouble, and Roland knew it. Suddenly, something hurled out of the walkway between the buildings and crashed into Roland, knocking him to the ground. Before he knew it, Roland was lying flat on his back, staring into the inch-long sharp teeth of that big black dog. Bits of flesh were stuck between the teeth, and the lips of the dog, curled up as it growled, were still wet and red. Roland opened his mouth to cry out for help, and the dog planted a dirty, wet paw over his lips, blocking any sound. Not just wet, Roland suddenly realized, but blood. Roland lurched abruptly, twisting his head and body sideways, and started heaving violently. To think that Bellatrix's blood had been in his mouth, sick all over, Roland heaved some more. When he finally stopped, Roland raised his head weakly, opened his mouth. "Help," he started to say, only to have his face pushed down into his own vomit. Coughing and sputtering, Roland raised his head again, struggling to get a breath. "Help," he started, and he could feel a weight on the back of his head relentlessly push his head back down. Roland squirmed frantically, his face half in, half out of the vomit. "No, please," he gasped quickly between coughs. "Don't," he pleaded. "I get it. You don't want me to make any noise. I won't, I swear." The pressure eased, and Roland felt the paw lift off his head. Roland spat repeatedly, trying to get everything out of his mouth. Then he used his arm and shirt sleeve to try to wipe the vomit off his face, mouth, and lips. There was something decidedly weird about the dog, the way it seemed to understand him when he talked. It was important somehow, but the reason eluded him. Roland started to lift himself off the ground, only to hear a low rumbling growl, feel the dog's breath in his ear, and something dripped on his neck. He froze, remembering the last neck this dog had been near. Roland gave an involuntary shiver when he felt something cold and wet on his skin. A tongue? At least Roland hoped that's what it was. Then he felt the soft tickle of whispers and a sharp tug on the collar of his shirt. The force of the tug pulled Roland around, dragging him forward, pulling him towards the walkway. His shirt twisted and bunched up uncomfortably around his throat, choking him. "Do you want me to come with you?" Roland guessed out loud while he fought for breath. "Is that it?" The tugging continued. Roland tried to loosen the hold on his neck, struggled to get his feet under him, but was pulled so fast he could do neither. Okay, he told the dog frantically between gasps. "I'll go with you. Just let me walk." Suddenly, the dog let go of his collar, and Roland fell to the ground, face forward. Lying still on the ground, Roland used the opportunity to get some much-needed air. The big dog stood silently on his right, just out of reach, watching. Roland could hear the sirens of arriving Muggle authorities. Should he risk everything and call out? No, he decided. The dog was too close. Help could not arrive in time. Roland slowly pulled himself to his knees and then his feet. He swayed shakily while he pulled down his shirt, wiped off his face and mouth again with the shirt sleeve, and spat on the ground several times, feeling decidedly unclean. At least if he were on his feet, Roland reasoned, he would have a better chance to fight or run. But before Roland could take a step, the dog darted forward, grabbed Roland's wrist firmly in his jaws, and started pulling Roland further down the narrow walkway. "Well," thought Roland to himself as he stumbled forward, "at least hanging on to my wrist is better than my neck." The dog moved Roland swiftly to the end of the building and around the corner. Roland was amazed at how fast the dog moved, despite the massive burn injuries on his hindquarters that showed raw and red. A dilapidated door hung loose on its hinges in the back of the building. Without hesitation, the dog led Roland to the door. The dog ran into it, pushing the door open with his body, and pulled Roland inside. The door swung shut with a clatter behind them. For a while, Roland couldn't see anything as he stumbled forward, urged on by the dog. The only light came from a small, cracked, dirty window near the door. Roland immediately feared a sinister purpose to the location, but then reasoned the dog could have easily killed him earlier, had that been his intention. The dog pulled Roland several meters into the room. Their steps echoed loudly as they moved. Then the dog stopped and let go of Roland's wrist. In the silence that followed, Roland could hear his own breathing and that of the dog somewhere nearby. It took a while for his eyes to adjust to the gloom. The room seemed to be an abandoned workshop of some nature. There were a few countertop tables, lots of trash, and some overturned benches between muggle equipment of some nature. Looking further, Roland spotted the silver collar of the dog, and then the dog itself. But was it the same dog? The dog that had brought Roland through the door had been a scary, vicious monster. This dog looked totally tame and meek by comparison. It laid down sphinx fashion on the ground, its head pointed up at Roland, mouth closed and ears cocked forward, looking at him intently. When Roland looked back, the dog immediately sat up on its haunches, wagged its burned tail slowly, lifted a front paw gently, and whined softly, all the while still watching Roland intently. Roland recognized the behavior as plainly doggy for, "Please?" "You want something, right?" asked Roland, still not sure how this dog could understand his words. In response, the dog yipped eagerly, wagged its tail faster, and raised up both legs briefly, in a begging fashion. "Okay," said Roland. "What?" The dog immediately stood and bowed its head. The front paws started scratching and tugging at the silver collar on its neck. He worked at it energetically, but could not dislodge the collar. "You want me to remove the collar? Is that it?" asked Roland. The dog yipped immediately and stood up, wagging its tail so hard its burnt hindquarters moved back and forth with the tail. Definitely a yes. Roland stared at the huge dog apprehensively, reluctant to go near. But looking at the dog that danced eagerly about now, it was difficult to remember that only minutes earlier it was snarling and ripping out throats. Roland knelt down in front of the dog. The dog stood still, trembling in anticipation. Only the tail moved back and forth. Roland studied the collar. It appeared to be a finely wrought silver snake that was wound twice around the dog's neck. Cautiously, Roland touched the collar. It felt cold and creepy. Taking a deep breath, Roland placed his hands on either side of the dog's neck. Gripping the snake firmly with his hands, he pulled. Nothing happened. Forgetting his fears, Roland closed his eyes and pulled with all his might, trying to get the collar over the dog's head, but it fit too snugly around the neck. Roland changed tactics, gripping the head of the snake with one hand and the tail with his other, and tried to unwind the snake from around the neck, but the metal wouldn't give or bend. Roland sighed in defeat. "I'm sorry," he told the dog regretfully, "but I can't get it off. I can't make it bend even just a little bit. Maybe if we had some tools." In response, the dog left Roland's side and trotted over to a pile of trash in the far corner of the room. He dug through the garbage briefly and returned carrying something in his mouth. A wand. For a moment, Roland's heart gave a happy leap of anticipation. But as the dog drew near, Roland realized the wand was not his, but Bellatrix's. "No," he told the dog firmly, "I can't use that. It's not my wand." "Where's my wand? Go get my wand and I'll try using it." But the dog continued to walk closer, stopping less than a meter from Roland. He lowered his head and dropped the wand at Roland's feet. Then the dog looked up at Roland with pleading eyes and whined softly. "No," insisted Roland. "I'll go get my wand," he suggested, and started to leave, but the dog instantly moved forward, blocking Roland's way, and growled threateningly. Roland froze in place. "I can't use that wand," he protested to the dog. "It's not permitted." The dog merely whined with that pleading look. He then bent down and used his nose to push the wand, rolling it until the wand touched Roland's feet. "I just can't," said Roland as he instinctively backed away. "Not that wand." The dog picked up the wand and brought it again to Roland, holding it out to Roland's hand while whining softly. Roland backed up again and stared fearfully at the wand without touching it. "I don't know any spells," he told the dog. "Honest. They don't teach us that kind at Hogwarts." The dog continued to whine. It moved forward and poked Roland insistently with the wand. Roland continued to back away from the wand and dog until he bumped into the wall behind him and could back away no more. Then the dog sat in front of Roland, wand in his mouth, raised both its front legs in a classic begging position, and whined some more. Roland could see the horrible burns all along the underside of his body, still raw and red. Roland sighed. The dog probably wouldn't let him leave unless he used the wand. "Okay," he told the dog reluctantly. "I'll try, but I can't promise anything." The dog nodded its head. Roland carefully took the wand from the dog's mouth. It felt wet and slimy from the dog, but otherwise not too bad. The dog moved so the collar showed easily and sat in front of Roland expectantly. Roland dried off the wand and gave it an experimental swish. He could feel the power run through it as the wand gave off a stream of bluish-gray sparks. Interesting, he thought. The Slytherins had always asserted terrible things would happen if an inferior ever attempted to use one of their wands. They were obviously mistaken, or lying. Encouraged, Roland set his mind to the task at hand with more enthusiasm. He studied the dog, if indeed it was a dog, and the collar he wore. It was plainly no ordinary collar and not intended to be removed. It had no buckle or lock and should have bent easily under his strength. It had also glowed and tightened under Bellatrix's control. Given the way the dog wanted so desperately to get rid of it, Roland knew the collar was much, much more. Bellatrix was said to be one of the most powerful witches alive, or rather had been, thought Roland, remembering that still body lying on the ground with all the blood around. He shivered unconsciously at the thought of someone or something brave and bold enough to attack Bellatrix, let alone succeed. Bellatrix probably had a hand in the construction of the collar. If not her, then someone of comparable strength. Roland gulped nervously, not wanting to think who that might have been. He shoved the scary thought aside and instead reviewed the many spells he knew. Being one of the top nons at Hogwarts, he knew a lot, but none of them seemed to fit the situation. Considering the abilities of those who probably made the collar, Roland decided it was doubtful any spell taught at Hogwarts would be strong enough to break the collar. There were other spells he knew, the stronger ones he had read about, but had not been permitted to practice. The Slytherins practiced those, especially those training to be new Death Eaters. Those spells might succeed in breaking the collar, but they were grand and splashy, designed to leave a visible, lasting impression on spectators. Any of them would probably kill the dog in the process. That left a collection of low-impact, non-charms and spells, which the Slytherins had little interest in and quite possibly had no knowledge of. They had been developed in secret by the nons to help each other cope with everyday Slytherin demands. Little things, mostly performed non-verbally, so the Slytherins wouldn't know they were happening. The collection included a large assortment of cleaning spells, food preparation spells, flavor charms to enhance a Slytherin's like or dislike of a food, anonymity charms to avoid Slytherin harassment, lifting and transporting spells, retrieval spells for larger items, and retrieval charms for the smaller things. Retrieval, mused Roland. Slytherins often used the nons as gophers to fetch items they wanted and were too lazy to get themselves. It was also common practice for the Slytherins to confiscate non-possessions and keep them as their own, just because. Though the nons considered such confiscation blatant theft, they dared not protest the behavior. Protesting was no guarantee the stolen item would be returned, and would only make things worse for the protester in terms of vindictive Slytherin harassment. Nons could, however, if not caught, retrieve confiscated items. If later questioned about a missing confiscated item, a non could honestly say he or she had not taken Slytherin property. Retrieval of confiscated items usually went unnoticed because the Slytherins rarely cared or remembered about the items they took after the actual taking. They often delighted more in the taking than the possession. Out of sight, out of mind. A stolen item retrieved quickly enough and kept out of sight could be totally forgotten by the Slytherin thief. When a Slytherin confiscated something, the victim would immediately notify the rest of the nons. One of the older nons would try to get close to the thief and retrieve the confiscated item before it was taken to the Slytherin dorms. Nons were not permitted to enter the Slytherin dorms. Retrieval charms were quick, quiet, and usually designed to get things out of small spaces, such as bags and pockets. Confiscated jewelry was the most difficult to retrieve, especially when the Slytherin thief decided to wear it as a trophy. Nons were warned time and time again to never wear jewelry at school, but there was always some first year who risked it anyway. As a matter of policy, all non necklaces and bracelets at Hogwarts were pre-enchanted while in the dorms with an emergency unclasp charm. When the non judged the time was right, he or she would give a non-verbal command and the confiscated necklace or bracelet would unlatch and drop unnoticed to the ground. A quick accio would then cause the stolen piece to fly into the non's waiting hand. Rings were the most difficult to retrieve as they had no clasp to pre-spell. Retrieval meant making the ring just a bit larger than the finger knuckle, then coaxing the ring to slip unnoticed off a Slytherin finger before dropping or flying into a waiting non-hand. Though it hadn't been confiscated and wasn't his, Roland thought he might be able to work the ring retrieval charm on the collar. After all, it did look a lot like a rather large ring. Roland closed his eyes and considered how he might best modify the ring retrieval charm. Usually, he had to do it silently with his wand concealed. It was a 3-step charm. First, Roland would cast a charm that nudged the metal in the ring, softening it. Then the inside of the ring would temporarily collapse in on itself, pushing the rest outward, just enough to make the ring loose around the finger, but not so much as to break or warp the ring. Finally, Roland would find the right moment, when the hand wearing the ring was down or busy, to call the ring, sliding it unnoticed off the finger. It was delicate work. Some of the girls were better at ring retrieval than him, but he had done his fair share successfully. Roland decided he would feel more comfortable working the charm with silent commands. That was how he always did it. Roland had never before worked on spelled metal. Would the metal react in the same way? If it did, he would have to nudge the metal much more than usual, given the larger size of the collar. But how much? Collapsing the ring in on itself so it pushed the rest outward was chancy, too. A dog's head was a pretty large knuckle. Could he cause the metal to push out far enough to slide over it? Then again, thought Roland, maybe he wouldn't have to nudge the whole ring. It was just the top and sides of the head that stuck out. At least he could take his time casting the charm and wouldn't have to hide the wand while he worked. That would help. Roland reviewed in his mind one last time what he intended to do, and then opened his eyes. The dog still sat in front of him, watching Roland expectantly. "Okay," Roland told the dog. "I'm ready." While Roland repositioned himself so he could aim at the top of the collar, he wondered briefly at the wisdom of trying to remove the collar. He had no idea who or what lay beneath. But, remembering the house motto, the dog was definitely no Slytherin and needed help. In fact, using Wizard Pilkington's hair-splitting logic, there was no alert out on the dog, and Roland hadn't actually seen the dog kill Bellatrix. "Don't move," he told the dog while he aimed his wand. Immediately, the soft thumping of the tail stopped. Roland took a deep breath. "Malaby," he said to himself. He could feel the power course through the wand, but could see nothing. That was to be expected. The wearer of a ring to be retrieved couldn't know it was happening. But had it worked? The dog whined anxiously. "Hush," Roland told the dog. "I'm not yet finished." Now he had to wait. Roland wasn't sure how long, but at least for a few minutes. Retrieval charms worked slowly. There was no need for immediate speed in the first part. They took into account the moving target that was not always in the right position held by someone who could not know what was going on. Roland waited longer than he usually did. He had used more force than normal, and the item to be retrieved was bigger than the usual ring. Now for the collapsing. Roland again pointed his wand at the same location. "Diminuet," he said in his mind. He watched the collar closely. He should be able to see some effect of this part of the charm, but he wasn't sure what. The rings they used in practice tended to flatten from the inside out. It wasn't much and not really noticeable, unless you were looking for it, but always enough to make the ring removal possible. The collar seemed to glow, but Roland couldn't see any other difference. "Diminuet," repeated Roland, putting more force in the command. This time he saw just the faintest of flattening on the top of the snake-like shape. Roland changed his position to face the dog. He had to act more swiftly now. The spell was temporary. The Nons did not want a partially completed spell being discovered by the Slytherins, so if a ring could not be retrieved at this point, it would revert back to its original state. Roland didn't know how temporary was temporary with bewitched metal. He pointed the wand at the collar and took a deep breath. "Accio ring," he said in his mind. Nothing happened. "Accio ring," he repeated more forcefully. Still, nothing happened. Roland tried again. "Accio ring," he said forcefully out loud. Nothing. The dog whined in disappointment, and Roland stared at the collar, dismayed. He set down the wand on the nearby counter and bent down to examine the collar. He knew it had flattened, so why wasn't the charm working? Roland gingerly placed a finger beneath the collar where he had aimed his spell. Yes, the metal did seem somehow softer than before. Maybe not soft enough. He'd been worried about that. But if that were the case, the collar should have risen up the neck at least a bit in an effort to come when Roland said Accio, and it hadn't. Maybe it was the Accio part that didn't work. Roland grasped the collar on either side and pulled. Slowly, the collar slid up the dog's neck. Unlike before, the collar didn't stop at the base of the skull, but continued to move when Roland pulled. Roland eagerly shifted his fingers and tugged at the top part of the collar, stretching and forcing the collar over the rounded part of the skull. Then he pulled the collar out on one side to force it over an ear, and then the other. Suddenly, like a cork coming out of a bottle, a loud pop sounded. Roland fell back on the ground with the collar in his hands, and the dog was free. Before Roland could recover his balance, the dog leaped up and snatched the wand from the counter with his mouth. Whirling smoothly around, the dog headed swiftly towards the door. Roland watched a blur of black veer away from the door, jumping instead through the window, shattering glass along the way. In an instant, the dog had vanished completely from sight. "Well," said Roland to himself as he stood up, "so much for thank yous." He brushed himself off and looked around thoughtfully. Bellatrix's wand had been hidden in the room. Maybe his wand was here as well. Roland stretched out his hand. "Accio wand," he called out forcefully. Nothing happened. "Darn," he muttered in disappointment. "Oh, well," he told himself with resignation. It was just a thought. Roland looked at the collar still in his hand. It was of no use to him, but Roland was reluctant to toss something he knew to be bewitched metal where muggles might find it. Roland finally stuffed the collar in his pocket to give to Wizard Pilkington later. He would surely know what to do with it. Thinking of Wizard Pilkington, Roland looked around and drew out his cell phone. It looked like a safe enough place to call. He would be quite worried about Roland by now. "Did you use your wand?" exploded the voice in Roland's ear. Roland winced at the question. Why did he have to bring up the wand so soon? Couldn't he have at least asked how Roland was first? But of course, he did not know about the second incident with the dog, and so would assume Roland was not only fine, as previously reported, but in a secure location, as instructed. The voice had answered on the first ring, a sure indication he had been waiting anxiously for Roland's call. Yes, sir," replied Roland guiltily, knowing full well he was supposed to watch, not act. "What spell?" "Expelliarmus." A long silence followed. They both knew there was only one reason to use that spell, which meant Roland must have been more involved in Bellatrix's death than previously mentioned. Anything else? No, sir, replied Roland, breathing a sigh of relief, glad he hadn't been asked to explain further. Proceed to the Lockhart Dueling Club as soon as possible. You need to practice your dueling skills. I'll meet you there to observe your progress. Ingenious, actually. One extra Expelliarmus amongst many would never be noticed within a dueling club. There was just one problem with that. I don't have my wand, blurted Roland, knowing a lack of wand had just compounded his troubles. Another long silence followed. Where is it? The voice finally asked. I don't know, replied Roland honestly. Where did you last see it? On the ground next to Bellatrix, next to her body. I've still got some disillusionment charm, Roland added tentatively, filling the silence that followed. I could try to sneak back and get it. Negative, replied the voice firmly. It's too dangerous. You go to the club and practice. But I can't go there without a wand, protested Roland. A wand is not necessary for practice, countered the voice. Now, go to the club. That's an order, the voice insisted sternly. Then it added in a softer tone, let me worry about the wand. Yes, sir, replied Roland reluctantly. Making it an order changed the situation. It would be dire consequences if he failed to follow the orders of a superior officer. Roland turned off the phone and walked to the door. Pulling it open, Roland cautiously poked his head out. The alley was empty, so Roland stepped quietly outside. He turned and followed the narrow alley until it came out on the street that adjoined Grimmauld Place. Roland moved swiftly down the sidewalk, ignoring the official vehicles with sirens and blaring lights that passed by. He reached Grimmauld Place, crossed it, and kept on going straight. Roland rounded the corner and reached his motorbike without incident. After making sure there were no witnesses, he deactivated the disillusionment charm. Then Roland wheeled his motorbike across the street, turning it around. He got on, started the motor, and took off. Roland had scarcely traveled a block when a tall figure wearing red-brown pants and a white shirt stepped out into the street, blocking his way. Normally, Roland would have quickly wheeled around the person and gone on his way, but this person held out his hand and pointed a wand at Roland, Bellatrix's wand. Roland skidded to a stop and stared at the man. He was tall and very thin, with a thick mat of tangled gray hair that hung over his shoulders. Ugly raw burns covered his bare feet and continued up both ankles until hidden by the two short pant legs. Roland recognized the clothes as some that had once hung from a line behind one of the houses at Grimmauld Place. The man looked like a sinister street bum, but within the deep, dark sockets his eyes were clear, and the hand holding the wand was firm and steady. Tucked inside his pants waistband was a second wand, Roland's. Without a word, the man pointed his, Bellatrix's wand, to a nearby narrow alley, a clear indication of what he wanted. Roland nodded his assent. Their business was not for a public street. Roland parked his bike on the street curb and walked to the alley. He could hear the man following behind with a steady limp. When Roland had gone into the alley several meters, he stopped and turned around. The man stopped too. Swaying slightly, the man winced visibly as he readjusted his feet to a wider stance to keep his balance. All the while, the man kept the wand steadily pointed towards Roland. Roland watched and waited. I figured you'd want your wand back, said the man in a gravelly voice as he used his free hand to remove the wand from his waistband. He tossed the wand to Roland. Roland reached out and caught the wand with his fingers, welcoming it like an old friend. Thanks, he said to the man as he tucked the wand securely away. Thank you, replied the man, watching Roland steadily. The, collar? He asked, his wand pointing towards the pocket where Roland had put it. Roland looked down self-consciously. Yeah, he said, pulling the silver collar from his pocket. It has a trace, began the man, explaining, so the person carrying it can always be found. Yes, of course, said Roland, remembering how Bellatrix had used her wand to find the dog. He held the collar out towards the man, who looked at it warily. Roland shuddered to think what might have happened had the Death Eaters looked for the dog and found Roland instead. Toss it over there, instructed the man, using his wand to point to an area behind Roland. Roland did as he was told. The collar fell with a loud clatter. Before the sound had stopped, the stranger had aimed his wand and shouted, "Bombarda Maxima!" The collar exploded with a loud boom, sending showers of silver bits into the air. A series of loud pops occurred next, as bits of silver exploded a second time when they touched each other, the walls or ground. Both Roland and the stranger watched the silver bits continue to explode over and over again as the smaller pieces touched something, until all the popping finally died out, leaving a silvery powder all over the ground. "It was supposed to explode if broken," commented the man, stating the obvious. Roland stared. He hadn't known. He could have used the wrong spell. Roland looked up at the man. "But that means you could have died." "Better that than return," replied the man dryly, looking away from Roland. "Better you than them." The revelation left Roland shaken. He didn't speak, didn't know what to say. Not since Cousin Eric had Roland spoken with someone so determined. Roland could see now that this man had had the same sort of look as Eric, a sadness and a haunted quality in his eyes. The man shifted on his feet, wincing, and then said, "That's why it had to be her wand, so it wouldn't be traced back to you." "Oh," said Roland, overwhelmed. He was touched by the effort the man, this stranger, had taken to protect him. "That was an inspired spell, by the way, whatever it was," added the man, looking back at Roland with a faint smile. Roland felt himself flush with pride. The man continued, "I never expected to, well, you know, live." The man's voice died, and he looked down uncomfortably. Then he looked up again at Roland. "I took care of the bag for you," the man said abruptly, changing the subject. "What?" asked Roland, having forgotten all about his original purpose at Grimmauld Place. "Oh, yes," said Roland, remembering. "The bag. Thanks. That would not have been good if the authorities had found the bag." "That was an excellent sandwich, by the way," continued the man, watching Roland closely. "The best I've had in decades. Did you fix it?" No," replied Roland uncomfortably, unwilling to reveal he hadn't even known the contents of the bag. "Oh. Did the voice on the phone fix it?" Voice? Roland thought frantically. How had the man known about him? Then he remembered his first call had been made in front of the dog. "I don't know," Roland answered honestly. "I think so." "Oh. Good job," said the man approvingly. "Good man. Smart. You do what he says, and he'll keep you safe." "Yes, sir," agreed Roland. Then the man added, "It's nice to know she had some support, even if she didn't know it." "She? Oh, the girl." Began Roland uncertainly. "Where is she?" "Mustn't tell," replied the man, shaking his head. "It's too dangerous for you to know. She needs some time to do what she's trying to do." "What's that?" The man shook his head again. "They'd kill you for sure if they thought you knew that. If she succeeds," the man added with a crazy laugh, "well, it boggles the mind to think what things will be like if she succeeds." "And if she doesn't?" asked Roland curiously. The man got serious and looked at Roland straight in the eyes. "Then they'll be sorry they ever let me live." And Roland felt a shiver go through his body at the words. An emergency vehicle with loud sirens zoomed by. The man looked up at the sound. "I'd best be going," he told Roland, "and you had too." The man pocketed Bellatrix's wand, turned, and started limping slowly down the alley the way they had come. Roland stared momentarily and then hurried to catch up. "Don't you hurt?" he asked the man, remembering all the burns he had seen on the dog's body. The man shrugged as he walked. "Could be worse," he said philosophically. They reached the main street together. "Thanks again," said the man, and he headed slowly down the street, leaving Roland standing by his bike. Roland stared after him thoughtfully. Mister?" called out Roland tentatively. The man stopped, turned, and looked at Roland. "You want to take my motorbike?" He saw the man's eyes light up at the suggestion. "Really?" "Sure." "But what about you?" the man asked with concern. "I've got bus money," replied Roland confidently. "But they'll know." "Nah," assured Roland. It's Muggle technology. They never keep track of things like that. Well, began the man hesitantly, if you're certain. Obviously he wanted it, yet was reluctant to accept. I'm certain, assured Roland, striding forward and holding out the keys to the man. Then Roland added, somehow, I think you need the bike more than me. The man looked from the keys to Roland with shining eyes. Thanks, he said gruffly while taking the keys. This means a lot. He proceeded to limp over to the motorbike. Mounting the bike, the man started the motor with the ease of an experienced rider. He looked over at Roland after he revved up the motor experimentally. This has been an incredible morning, he told Roland with a smile that seemed to light up his face. Simply incredible. Then the man gunned the engine and started down the street. He increased the speed and was soon out of sight. As Roland started down the street towards the bus stop, he pulled out his cell phone. He could not let anyone unnecessarily risk his or her life trying to locate his wand. Report, came the voice. I've got my wand, said Roland without any preamble. There was a silence then. Did you go back? The voice asked ominously. No, sir, replied Roland firmly. I got it another way. He was glad he had managed to get the wand without disobeying orders. Very well, said the voice. Has the wand been used since? No, sir, assured Roland. At least he didn't think the stranger had done anything with it. Then proceed to the original destination immediately. Yes, sir, said Roland. It may take me a bit longer to get there than expected. I'm taking the bus. The bus? What about your motorbike? It, became unavailable, replied Roland wryly. He could hear all sorts of unasked questions in the very long silence that followed. Very well, said the voice finally. Get there as soon as you can. Yes, sir, said Roland. He closed the phone and returned it to his pocket. The man was right, he thought, as he moved swiftly down the sidewalk. This has been an incredible morning.